The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. I'm Pete Mulford. I'm a therapist and coach, and I'm going to be running this webinar tonight. People are still just logging on, so I'll just give people a few seconds to actually log on. You should be all able to see my screen now. As it says there, for those people that are joining us, I'm Pete Mulford, and I'm a therapist and coach. And I do what I do today because back in 2003, my wife Debbie was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, and well, some doctors referred to it as chronic fatigue syndrome, some doctors referred to it as ME. But the key thing was there was no real help. There was a lot of confusion, and the only real help was the offer of antidepressants if she got fed up with having no life or any hope of recovery. Before I get going though, I'd like to just explain a few things. I'm going to be asking you to have a look at some YouTube videos as we go because, for example, Debbie, my wife, is putting her little girl to bed, so she can't be with us tonight, but we have recorded her speaking, and it's useful to know how to operate the software. So you've got a little control panel like this that you should be able to see. The key things for you is these bits over here. If your control panel disappears, this icon here in orange will bring it back or hide it. Okay. This one is obviously expands it or contracts it. The other one that's useful is this one here. This allows you to put your hands up. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be asking you to look at a YouTube video, and then when you finish watching the YouTube video, if you can just pop your hands up for me by clicking on that icon, I can then see on my control panel that you've raised your icon, or you've raised your hand rather, and I can then carry on with my part of the presentation. And once you've raised your hand, just click on it again and your hand will go back down again. So just bring it up for a bit and then pop it back down again. Okay, that's great. So the presentation tonight, the webinar, basically is on what we learned as Debbie got better. And it's on, you know, I talk about alternative and effective treatments for chronic fatigue. We talk about what we actually tried, what we learned, and what we actually found in the end was of most help for her. Now, how it all began. Let's start at the beginning. Certainly for us, the beginning started with Debbie's story. Prior to Debbie becoming ill with chronic fatigue or ME, I hadn't really come across the condition at all. Debbie basically was, you know, an energetic, hard-working teacher, struck down by a mysterious illness. Nobody knew what it was. She went to the doctors. She had a flu-like symptom, and it just kind of spiraled from there. But what we'll do is I'll let you hear Debbie talking about it herself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you a link on your little interface. It will come up on the chat icon. If you click on it, you'll be able to actually watch Debbie speaking about it herself. So I'm just going to copy it. I'm just going to paste it now. Okay, so if you look at your little control icon, I'll just whiz back so that you can see it. So here now, on your desktop, you should see a link which you can follow, and then you can just watch Debbie speaking and talking herself. For those of you joining us, everyone's just watching a YouTube video. I'll just send the link again. Okay, that's great. Thank you. I can see people are coming to the end of the YouTube video. The hands are going up. So for those of you that have just joined, the silence was because I'd sent a link to a YouTube video that people were watching, which was my wife Debbie talking about when she was diagnosed. If you didn't get that, if for some unknown reason there were technical problems, all of this you'll get a link to later anyway, which will allow you to go through the presentation and see the YouTube videos again. So basically Debbie ended up with this diagnosis of chronic fatigue or ME, and that was pretty much it. That was pretty much all the help we got. I got on the net and I investigated it all to see what it meant, and you know, I found that the list of symptoms that people with ME and chronic fatigue got is huge. Not everybody gets all of them. Some people get more than others, etc. And that's this big list here. And basically Debbie had all the ones that were in red. So she had the severe fatigue, she had the exercise intolerance, she had the cognitive dysfunction or the brain fog. If I ask her what she wanted for tea, even making that decision was often too much. She had problems with her autonomic nervous system, as it says here, palpitations. She'd often describe like a feeling where she felt like she was shaking inside. Temperature control was all off. She'd faint for no apparent reason as well. That was another thing that she had. She'd often get the flu-like symptoms, the original virus that she had. The symptoms were, you know, still with her months later. She had autoimmune problems. Her thyroid was being attacked by her immune system, and at one stage that was what the doctors wanted to do, was to give her thyroxine, but she didn't end up taking that, and now it's fine. She had sleep disturbances. She would sleep all through the day and not feel rested, have trouble getting off to sleep at night. We noticed as well that she'd become very alcohol intolerant. At the time when she was ill, we were both teachers, and we both used to have a glass of wine in the evening to relax. We were kind of in that vicious circle of coffee during the day to give us a boost and keep us going, and a glass of alcohol in the evening to mellow us out and relax us. And she'd become very intolerant to it. A glass of wine would certainly trigger off these symptoms even more excessively. And so in the end she stopped having the wine, because she realised that if she had it, she was then bad for several days afterwards. And basically I'd had unsatisfactory experiences with the NHS. I go into this in a bit more detail in other places, but I kind of stopped looking at doctors as necessarily having all of the answers, and I'd been aware that doctors disagree with each other, they have different opinions. Some of them state their opinions as facts, and others will then contradict that. And when I began looking at chronic fatigue and realised that the doctors really weren't going to come up with the answers, I began researching it myself. And initially the results were depressing. I come across tales of people being ill for years and never recovering, and all sorts of sort of horror stories. And for whatever reason though, I began looking at the stories of those people that did recover. I kind of got to the stage where I thought there's not really anything to learn by listening and reading the story of someone that's been ill for 10 years. There's more to learn from somebody that's been ill for 10 years and then got better. So that's what I started to do. I started to look at those people that got better. And overall I found common elements. I found common elements between Debbie's story and the other people that I was finding through my research. The common elements were often, and these were certainly true for Debbie: stressful job, stressful private life. She just moved down to Cornwall. She didn't really know anybody. There was often a viral infection that triggered the onset of this mysterious condition. And there was kind of a bit of a characteristic of struggling on, feeling that you're not going to let it beat you. You've got to keep going, kind of mentality. And it often surprises me, and I can understand why people get so upset by it. You find some people that would turn around and say, oh, people with chronic fatigue are lazy. And actually I think it's exactly the opposite way round. I think people with chronic fatigue generally don't know when to stop and don't know when to rest and relax. They're the kind of people that are always on the go. So far from being lazy, I think they're the opposite of lazy. And in Deb's case, symptoms developed and they got worse. They didn't get better with time. And we were going to the doctors, and the doctors didn't know what was making her ill or how to really help her recover. Towards the end, I was going to the doctors with her because she was coming out of the doctors, and I was saying, what did the doctor say? And she was saying, I can't really remember, and she was just so confused that it got to the stage where I had to go with her. I had to go in order to tell the doctor what was happening, and also to hear and understand what the doctor was telling us. And there was a barrage of tests as well, even from the beginning. There was blood tests and sort of talk of other tests, and it was all kind of worrying and scary because the doctors didn't really know what was going on. And so that's what we were left with. There was worry about health. Why was she still ill after, sort of 4 or 5 weeks of a virus? How the school was going to take it, her being off sick. And all of these kind of things were causing worry, and all of the time more symptoms were developing, and the symptoms she had were just getting worse, and she was just in this spiral of negative health, basically. Now, what we've come to know now, working with a lot of people that have got chronic or had chronic fatigue syndrome and had ME and related conditions, is that there's often other initial circumstances. We've noticed sometimes people are just living in the fast lane, so they won't be aware that they're stressed. They may be at university and out every night, working hard during the day, partying hard in the evening, or they've got jobs which maybe they love but are constant and on the go. There is this characteristic of ignoring the need to rest, though. That is kind of fairly common. Some people have had external demands. Some people have had children or family, caring for other people, sort of beyond the normal run-of-the-mill kind of looking after a young child or looking after, other members of the family by cooking them meals. Sort of external demands that are quite unrelenting. And the other thing we sometimes find is a stressful past as well. Sometimes we find the past has been stressful, and then somebody's got into what seems like a good place. They seem like everything should be okay, and then they get a virus, and then it kicks in, even though they're not necessarily living in the fast lane at that period of time. And triggers. While a virus is often a common trigger, there are other triggers we come across. We've come across people that have had it triggered from emotionally stressful events, things like bereavements, splitting up with, families splitting up, marriages splitting up, that kind of emotionally stressful event, being sacked from a job when you weren't expecting it. Accidents, that's the other thing, that the physical shock of an accident seems to sometimes be a trigger. So there are other triggers. And vaccines as well. That one's another one that pops up occasionally. People will have a vaccine, and a vaccine will sometimes appear to trigger this negative spiral of health. And that's what everybody seems to end up in. And indeed, there are studies that have actually shown that being chronically ill is stressful in itself, and this is the kind of stress cycle that people get in. So that happened over 4 or 5 weeks. It was kind of a 4 or 5 week period where she went from kind of just having a virus that was the same as other people at school had got, to it being seemingly worse than what other people had had and lingering around. And then it was another few months where there was a kind of fairly rapid spiral down into ill health. But Debbie's health now is fine. She works as hard as anyone else. She exercises, she runs, she's part of our business. We've just had a little girl who's now 1.5 years old. She's now fully functioning, and the journey to health took quite a while. As I say, I was studying people that got better, and I was trying whatever they said. So there was a lot of people that said they found homeopathy helped. So although I didn't really believe in homeopathy, I trundled her off to our nearest homeopathist. And back in 2003, that was actually 20 miles away. It seems incredible now when I know of 2 homeopathists that are within 10 minutes of my house down here in Cornwall. Back then it was a journey into our nearest city. And it certainly helped a little bit, but Debbie was still very ill, still prone to flare-ups for no obvious reason. Any kind of exertion would certainly trigger it off. We tried supplements. I was finding a lot of people on the net saying, different supplements would help, things like olive leaf extract, which is very good very good herb for killing off bacterial infections and viruses and things. And so, we bought that. And if there was a vitamin that was linked with somebody getting better and more than one person said that it had helped them, we bought it. So we were spending about £350 a month on vitamin supplements and herbs. Somebody else recommended osteopathy, so we saw an osteopath. Nearest osteopath was in Plymouth, so it was a 35-minute, 40-minute drive away. But off we went into Plymouth every week to see an osteopath. And we also focused on nutrition as well. We cut out some elements. Some people had suggested that things like dairy were causing sort of internal infections and problems, and so we cut out dairy. And we also started having lots of smoothies full of fruit, vitamins, and things that were kind of meant to help people get healthy and better, basically. And all of these things helped a little bit. I mean, they all had some kind of an effect. They all seemed to lift her from the lowest points that she had been in, but she was still prone to bad flare-ups, and she was still unable to do much. Well, we certainly wouldn't bother planning on doing anything with friends, because there was kind of an 80-90% chance that Deb would just be exhausted and not be able to cope, not be able to join in the conversation, and just need to go to bed. So our kind of social life still, basically really went down the pan. But we kept on. We kind of never really lost hope, or I never really lost hope. Deb admits to much of the time being a bit foggy, really, for her. But I had hope that she would be better, and I kept looking. And after a few months, I began to notice patterns. I began to notice that Deb would certainly always have a bad flare-up if there was any kind of stressful situation. And that stress wasn't always the classic stress we think of, like if she had to have a visit with the occupational therapist for work. That would certainly trigger off bad symptoms, not just leading up to it, but afterwards as well. But it wasn't just things like that. It was things like loud noises, strong smells, visual stimulus, any kind of emotional, or what we kind of tend to think of as negative emotions of guilt and sadness, and any kind of psychological worry. And I'd noticed that because some of the things that she used to do that she used to like going to the mall shopping, I could literally see the energy drain from her as she walked through the mall doors. The noises, the smells, the visual stimulus, it was almost as if they were sucking the energy from her. So I couldn't really understand how useful this information was at the time, but I certainly did begin to notice a pattern. And soon after, I was watching the television, and I saw a person who was in a wheelchair suffering from MS, and they were being helped to walk by somebody who was using neuro-linguistic programming. Now, it was Paul McKenna. It was a program that he did. And he'd been helping people with phobias and fears and confidence issues and all sorts. And I kind of understood that. But when he helped somebody with MS who was in a wheelchair, he helped them walk. And I think the lady wanted to walk down the aisle. Her daughter was being married. When he helped the person do that, I was kind of fairly amazed, because he didn't walk along beside her holding her hand or anything. What he did was this talking therapy that gave the lady the ability to go from being in a wheelchair, as she'd been for several months, to actually getting up and walking. And I thought, well, if it can help MS, maybe it could help Deb, and maybe it could help people with ME and chronic fatigue. Now I'm going to jump to the present now. I mean, it did help. It was part of what we used to get Debbie back to full health. And the hardest thing to understand is okay, how does stress make us physically ill? That was what I had actually noticed. That was the pattern that I'd noticed. I began to notice it more and more, that stressful situations were making her ill. And it's the hardest thing to understand, because we take stress for granted and we often think that there's nothing we can do about it. It's just a part of modern day life. But it is a part that's actually not doing us any good. So I'd like to just talk about what stress is. Ironically, it's what's kept us alive for centuries. I mean, as the little diagram shows there, it's the fight or flight response. Something scary pops up when you're not expecting it, and your instinct is either to fight it or to run away from it. So it's either fight or flight. And that's what stress is. It's the word we use to describe the situation where we're in the fight or flight response, or the freeze response, which is also associated with it. The freeze response is when the thing is just so big, so scary, so overwhelming that we don't fight, we don't flight, we just freeze. We play possum and hope the big thing goes away. And so we tend to think of this as a mental process, as being just a thought process, but actually it's hugely biological. I mean, we are biologically reacting to a threat, and a threat that we think is like a tiger or a stampeding herd of buffalo or some other cave person trying to steal our lunch. So in order to survive that threat, we unconsciously prioritize the functions that are going to allow us to survive whatever the danger is. And that's what we do. We start priming our system so that it can either fight or it can run away. Now, it primes the system by producing, or our bodies kind of automatically produce, around 1,400 different chemical reactions. It's kind of a cascade effect. I've described it as almost like if you can imagine an airport. You know, an airport is fairly relaxed. People are going on holiday. People are arriving. Everything's tickety-boo and working okay. And then somebody with a balaclava and a bazooka walks through the door, and all hell lets loose. Somebody rings the alarm. You've got the cascade of the medical services rushing to the airport to get ready to deal with casualties. You've got the police rushing to the airport. You've got military services rushing to the airport. And the person that was in control of the airport suddenly isn't. He's taken over by somebody who knows how better to deal with the threat. And everything's locked down. And you get that cascade. You phone the ambulance service, somebody else issues a command and 20 ambulances run to the airport. You phone the fire brigade, somebody else gives a command and 10 fire engines rush to the airport. And when we get stressed, we have that same kind of cascade of reactions. Now, you've been listening to me for about 25 minutes, so you might like a bit of a break from hearing from me. So what I'm going to do is, rather than go into the details of the stress response myself, I'm going to suggest that you just watch this little YouTube video, because it's quite nice. It uses cartoons, so it's quite light-hearted, but it's got some really valid points. So like before, I'm going to send it to you in the chat window, so that's going to come up on your little interface. And when you've finished watching it, if you can raise your hands using the raise your hands thing, then I can carry on. I've noticed some questions, so when we come back from the video, I'll answer the questions, and then at the end of the webinar, I'll answer some more questions then as well. Okay? So I'll just go quiet while you all watch the video.